London had not been this silent in living memory. Not since the last Great War, not since the Plague years, not since any moment that ordinary people could point to and say, that was the day the world changed. But February 2, 1901 was different. This silence was chosen. It was worn like a garment pulled tight across the shoulders of 4 million people who lined the streets of the city that had once been the center of everything, standing in the bitter cold with black armbands and uncovered heads, waiting for a coffin to pass. Queen Victoria had been dead for 12 days. She had died at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight on the evening of January 22nd, surrounded by children and grandchildren who represented nearly every royal house in Europe. She had reigned for 63 years, 7 months and 2 days. She had outlasted 11 prime ministers, 2 major wars, and the complete transformation of the world she had been born into. She had been crowned when railways were new and died when aeroplanes were being dreamed of. And now, on a gray February morning with frost still clinging to the iron railings outside Buckingham Palace, the empire she had shaped was preparing to carry her to her final resting place. The funeral procession had been planned with the precision of a military campaign. Every position on the route from Victoria Station to Windsor Castle had been assigned, reviewed, and assigned again. Senior officers had spent 3 weeks in committee rooms arguing over formation distances, the correct angle of rifle salutes, and which regiments would be granted the honor of marching closest to the gun carriage bearing the coffin. Colonels had lobbied for position. Majors had pulled whatever strings remained to pull. The entire machinery of British military ceremony had ground itself into motion with the slow, unstoppable weight of an institution that took its rituals more seriously than most nations took their constitutions. Corporal Thomas Hale had been assigned the rear flank. He was 19 years old. He had been in uniform for 14 months, posted to the 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards 8 months prior, following a training period that his commanding officer had described in written evaluation as satisfactory but unremarkable. He was not tall by guardsman standards, though he carried himself with the particular straightness that drill sergeants hammer into young men until it becomes unconscious. He had brown hair cut close beneath his bearskin, gray eyes that tended to focus on things other people had already stopped looking at, and hands that were slightly too large for his frame. The hands of someone who had grown fast and not quite caught up with himself yet. The rear flank was not a post that anyone had fought over. It was the position you gave to the youngest, the least senior, the ones whose primary qualification was that they could stand still for 6 hours without disgracing the regiment. The cameras would be at the front of the procession. The foreign dignitaries would be watching the gun carriage. The history being made that morning would be made at the head of the column, where King Edward VII would walk behind his mother's coffin with Kaiser Wilhelm II at his side, and where the eyes of the entire world would be focused. Thomas had accepted his assignment without complaint, which his sergeant had noted as either commendable discipline or simple indifference. Either way, he had spent the previous evening doing what he always did when preparing for something important. He had read the manual. Not the summary, not the briefing sheet that had been distributed to junior ranks with the key points helpfully underlined. The actual manual, the full ceremonial protocol document produced by the Lord Chamberlain's office, 112 pages including appendices, covering every aspect of the state funeral procession from the positioning of the gun carriage wheels to the precise timing of rifle volleys at each waypoint. Most of his fellow corporals had glanced at the relevant pages and gone to sleep. Thomas had read it cover to cover, twice, in the lamplight of the barracks, while the man in the next bunk snored steadily through both readings. He had done this not because he expected to need it. He had done it because he was the kind of person who felt uneasy carrying responsibility for something he did not fully understand, even responsibility for the rear flank, even on a morning when the rear flank was just a formality. By 6 in the morning, he was in position. The streets around Victoria Station were already thick with people pressing against the barriers. Black was everywhere: black coats, black hats, black ribbons tied to anything that could hold a knot. The air smelled of coal smoke and cold stone, and the particular dampness of a London winter morning that has not quite decided whether to produce rain. Thomas stood at his post, rifle at his side, and watched the procession begin its final preparations with the quiet attention of someone who had read exactly how each piece was supposed to fit together. He noticed almost immediately that one piece did not fit. The foreign dignitaries had been positioned in a designated observation area to the left of the processional route, behind a temporary barrier draped in black velvet. There were perhaps 40 of them: ambassadors, attaches, representatives of European royal houses who had made the crossing to London specifically to witness this moment. They were dressed impeccably, most of them in dark military dress uniforms decorated with foreign medals and house insignia. They stood with the particular stillness of people who understood ceremony because their own lives were built around it. Thomas was not watching them specifically. He was watching the overall formation, checking that his own section was correctly positioned relative to the waypoint markers that had been chalked discreetly onto the cobblestones. It was a peripheral observation, the kind of background awareness that soldiers develop when they have been standing at attention long enough that their eyes begin moving on their own. That was how he first saw Count Ulrich Voss. The man was somewhere in his 50s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more formidable. He wore the dress uniform of a senior Austro-Hungarian diplomatic official, deep gray with gold epaulets, a row of campaign medals that caught the weak morning light, and a black mourning sash across his chest. He moved through the observation area with quiet, practiced purpose, the way people move when they know exactly where they are going and have already decided that anyone in their way will simply adjust. He was carrying a wreath. This was not, in itself, unusual. Several dignitaries had brought floral tributes. The protocol for this had been clearly outlined in the manual. Tributes were to be presented at a designated point on the route, received by a ceremonial attendant, and placed according to a predetermined arrangement that had been approved by the Lord Chamberlain's office weeks in advance. The process was orderly, documented, entirely under control. What caught Thomas's attention was not the wreath itself, it was the size of it. The wreath Count Voss carried was substantially larger than the others he had seen. It was constructed on a heavy iron frame, wrapped in evergreen branches and white flowers that had been imported at some expense given the February date. It was the kind of wreath that demanded to be seen, not a quiet offering placed among others, but a statement designed to be photographed, to be recorded, to occupy its own space in the visual record of the day. And folded across the top of the frame, secured with black ribbon, was a sash. Thomas had looked at it for only a moment before something in his memory stirred. The sash was dark red, almost burgundy, with gold border trim and an embroidered central motif that he could not make out clearly from his distance. But the overall configuration, the specific combination of color, border, style, and the way the motif was centered rather than offset, matched something he had read about, not in the funeral protocol manual, in an appendix. Appendix 7, Diplomatic and Foreign Ceremonial Objects, Classification and Restriction Guidelines. He had almost skipped the appendices entirely. They were dry, densely written, and seemingly relevant only to people whose entire careers were built around the minutiae of diplomatic protocol. But he had read them anyway, because he had started the manual, and he did not stop things he had started. He stood very still for a moment, watching Count Voss move toward the processional entry point with his oversized wreath and his folded sash. And he felt the particular quality of discomfort that arrives when you recognize something that everyone around you has missed. Then he turned and found his sergeant. Sergeant Ronald Griggs had been in the Grenadier Guards for 22 years. He had stood at attention through 3 royal weddings, 2 jubilees, a state visit from the German Kaiser, and enough ceremonial occasions to have developed the ability to appear completely alert while thinking about something else entirely. He was a competent man and an efficient one, and on a morning when his primary concern was keeping 43 junior guardsmen in correct formation for 6 hours, he had very little patience for hypothetical problems raised by the youngest corporal in the section. Thomas explained what he had seen: the wreath, the size, the sash, the specific marking configuration from Appendix 7. Griggs looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. "Handle formation, Corporal. That's your assignment." Thomas tried his lieutenant next. Lieutenant James Forsyth was 24 years old, newly commissioned, and was at that precise moment deeply occupied with a conversation involving 3 senior officers and the exact positioning of the color party. He listened to approximately 40 words of Thomas's report, nodded with the expression of a man filing information into a mental drawer he intended never to open, and told Thomas to take it to Captain Alderton. Captain Henry Alderton was a practical man who had survived a long career in the Guards by being very clear about which problems were his and which problems belonged to someone else. He listened to Thomas's report with more patience than either Griggs or Forsyth had managed, which Thomas recognized as a bad sign, because it meant the captain was actually thinking about it. After a pause, Alderton looked at the observatin area where Count Voss was still moving steadily toward the processional entry point, then looked back at Thomas. "You're the one who read the appendix," he said. "You handle it." Thomas stood for a moment with the specific feeling of a person who has just been handed something heavy by someone who has already started walking away. He had no authority. He had no rank that would mean anything to a senior foreign diplomatic official. He had no official sanction, no written order, no superior standing at his shoulder. He had a corporal's stripes, a rifle, a bearskin hat, and the contents of Appendix 7 memorized with reasonable accuracy. He straightened his back, adjusted his grip on his rifle, and walked toward the processional entry point. The processional entry point was a gap in the barrier line where the route from the dignitary observation area connected to the main procession corridor. It was staffed by 2 ceremonial attendants from the Lord Chamberlain's office, older men in formal black coats who were responsible for receiving tributes and directing dignitaries to their assigned viewing positions. They were not soldiers. They were not equipped or authorized to stop anyone. Thomas reached the entry point 30 seconds before Count Voss did. He positioned himself in the center of the gap, rifle at his side, and waited. Count Voss approached with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never, in 53 years of diplomatic life, been stopped at a door by someone of lesser rank. He registered Thomas's presence and adjusted his pace only slightly, the way a large ship adjusts for a small obstacle it expects to move. "Corporal," he said it the way senior men say junior titles, not as an address but as a category, a classification, something to be noted and set aside. Thomas did not move. "Sir, this entry point is restricted to pre-approved tributes. May I see your Lord Chamberlain documentation for that wreath?" It was not a question. Count Voss stopped. For the first time, he focused on Thomas fully, really looked at him, taking in the age, the rank, the complete absence of any insignia that would explain why this particular young man felt entitled to be standing in his way on this particular morning. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, something more careful than anger. "I am Count Aldrich Voss, diplomatic attaché to the Austro-Hungarian Imperial Mission. I have attended this funeral at the personal invitation of His Majesty, King Edward. This wreath is a tribute from the Imperial House, offered in recognition of Her Majesty's role as grandmother to our Crown Prince." His English was perfect, shaped by decades of diplomatic posting. His voice carried the particular resonance of a man who understood that how you said something was frequently more important than what you said. Thomas heard all of it. He did not move. "The Lord Chamberlain's office maintains a registry of all approved tributes," he said. The registry was distributed to ceremonial posts as part of the processional briefing. "Your name is on the diplomatic attendance list, sir. Your wreath is not on the tribute registry." Count Voss's expression shifted again, a degree of reassessment. He had expected the young corporal to fold at the title and the credentials. Instead, he was being cited against a registry by someone who should not, by any reasonable expectation, have known the registry existed. This is an expression of mourning from one imperial house to another. Surely procedural documentation is secondary to the dignity of the occasion. Thomas looked at the sash folded across the top of the wreath frame. His eyes stayed on it for exactly long enough to make clear that he had noticed it and was not pretending otherwise. "Sir, the sash you are carrying, the border configuration and central motif." He paused. "That is a Habsburg territorial designation marker. Appendix 7 of the Lord Chamberlain's ceremonial protocol classifies it as a politically significant diplomatic object. Items in that classification cannot enter the processional corridor without specific authorization from the Foreign Office." The silence that followed had a different quality from the silences that had come before it. Count Voss was still, the kind of stillness that is not calm but is performing calm, his grip on the wreath frame adjusted by perhaps half an inch. His eyes had not left Thomas's face, and something in them had changed entirely. The comfortable assurance was gone, replaced by the expression of a man rapidly recalculating. "You are a corporal," he said, and now it was not a classification. It was a statement of disbelief. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, "and this entry point is closed to you until the documentation question is resolved." Around them, the procession was beginning to move. Somewhere ahead, the gun carriage was rolling forward, and the great grinding machinery of the Empire's farewell to its queen was in motion. The crowds beyond the barriers had gone even quieter, if such a thing was possible, as the sound of the funeral march reached them from the direction of Victoria Station. This was not a moment when anyone was looking at a rear flank entry point. This was not a moment when anyone was watching a 19-year-old corporal hold his ground against a senior foreign diplomat, with nothing but a memorized appendix and the refusal to step aside. Which was, Thomas understood, precisely why the moment existed. Count Voss straightened. He looked at Thomas with the expression of a man who has played a long game and found an unexpected obstacle at the final move. Then he said, very quietly, "I would like to speak with your commanding officer." Thomas said, "I'll send for him, sir. Until he arrives, you'll need to remain here." He did not send for Captain Alderton immediately. He sent for him in the way that military communications travel on ceremony days, through two intermediaries, across a section of the formation that was already in motion, with the guaranteed result that it would take several minutes to arrive. In those minutes, Thomas stood exactly where he was, and Count Voss stood exactly where he was, and between them lay the wreath with its folded sash, sitting in the frost-cold morning air like a question that had not yet been answered. Captain Alderton arrived in the manner of a man who has been interrupted during something important, and intends to communicate this clearly. He came at a brisk walk, jaw set. Already composing the reprimand, he planned to deliver to Corporal Hale for pulling a senior officer away from his post on the basis of some procedural concern about a diplomatic wreath. He stopped when he saw Count Voss. Not because he recognized the specific man, but because he recognized the specific expression, that particular combination of composure and calculation that senior diplomats wear when something has gone wrong, and they are deciding how to manage the aftermath. Alderton had seen that expression in drawing rooms and conference antechambers. He had never expected to see it at a processional entry point, being held by the youngest corporal in his section. His reprimand dissolved undelivered. "Captain," Count Voss stepped forward, extending his credentials with the smooth efficiency of a man accustomed to resolving situations through the proper application of rank and documentation. Your corporal has been detaining me on the basis of some procedural confusion about my tribute. I trust we can resolve this quickly, given the circumstances. Alderton took the credentials, looked at them, then looked at Thomas. Hale, explain. Thomas explained. The registry, the sash. Appendix 7, the territorial designation classification. Alderton looked at the wreath for a long moment. Then he looked at the sash. Then he looked at Count Voss with an expression that had become considerably more careful. He reached out and with 2 fingers lifted the edge of the folded sash where it was secured to the frame. Beneath it, tucked between the sash fabric and the iron frame, was a document, folded twice, sealed with a wax impression, written on paper with a letterhead that Alderton recognized the crest of the Austro-Hungarian Imperial Diplomatic Mission. He did not open it immediately. He looked at Count Voss. The Count's expression had achieved a remarkable stillness. The stillness of a man who has decided that the only remaining strategy is dignity. Alderton broke the seal and unfolded the document. He read it once quickly, and then read it again more slowly. Thomas watched his captain's face and saw something happen there that he had never seen before. A senior officer going completely, carefully blank. The way faces go when the information they have just received is too significant to react to in public. The document was a letter. It was addressed to the International Press Corps attending the funeral proceedings. It asserted, in precise diplomatic language, a European dynastic claim over a British-administered colonial territory in southern Africa. A claim that had been dormant for 11 years, quietly shelved after a series of treaty negotiations that had never fully resolved the underlying disagreement. The letter cited Queen Victoria's own statements about dynastic unity as supporting precedent. It was signed by 3 members of the Austro-Hungarian Imperial House, and it was intended to be photographed. Not read publicly, not delivered through official channels. Photographed beside Victoria's coffin, with Count Voss's wreath bearing the territorial sash visible in the frame, creating a single image that would circulate through every newspaper in Europe within 48 hours. An image that would show the imperial marker of a dynastic territorial claim placed at the funeral of the British Queen, implying her posthumous blessing of a claim she had never formally endorsed, and that the British Foreign Office had spent a decade carefully managing. It was not violence. It was not espionage in any conventional sense. It was a photograph. A single, carefully composed, politically devastating photograph that would cost nothing to create and everything to undo. Alderton folded the document. He placed it inside his coat with the deliberate movements of a man who is making very sure his hands do not shake. Then he looked at Count Voss and said, with the measured courtesy of someone who has understood that the next 60 seconds must be handled with absolute precision, "Count Voss, I am going to ask you to accompany me." Count Voss inclined his head. He did not protest. He did not invoke diplomatic immunity. He simply looked at Thomas once, a long, measuring look that contained no hostility and no particular warmth, but carried the unmistakable quality of genuine assessment, and then turned and walked with Alderton back toward the Foreign Office liaison station that had been established 200 meters behind the processional route. He left the wreath behind. Thomas stood beside it and looked at it for a moment. The flowers were beautiful. The ironwork was expensive. The sash lay folded against the frame in its dark burgundy and gold, entirely harmless looking in the gray morning light. He lifted the wreath carefully and carried it to the nearest ceremonial attendant from the Lord Chamberlain's office, who received it with raised eyebrows and no questions. Then Thomas removed the sash, folded it once more, and placed it inside his own breast pocket, where it would remain until he could deliver it through proper channels. He straightened his coat, adjusted his bearskin, picked up his rifle, and returned to his post. The gun carriage bearing Queen Victoria's coffin passed Thomas Hale's position at the rear flank at 22 minutes past 10 in the morning. He could not see it directly from where he stood. The procession was too long, the street too narrow, the crowds too deep along both barriers. What he could see was the effect of it, the ripple of uncovered heads moving through the crowd like a slow wave, the particular quality of silence that deepens when something sacred passes close, the way 40,000 people managed to communicate grief in perfect unison without making a sound. He stood at attention and stared at the middle distance, the way guardsmen are trained to do, seeing everything and appearing to see nothing. Behind him, somewhere in the direction of the Foreign Office liaison station, Count Voss was being processed through a procedure that would be handled quietly, efficiently, and without public record. His credentials would be reviewed. The document would be confiscated and forwarded to the appropriate desk at the Foreign Office, where it would join a collection of similar documents in a file that already existed for exactly this kind of territorial claim. The Imperial mission would receive a formal communication through diplomatic channels within 72 hours. Not a protest, nothing inflammatory, just a quiet and very clear signal that the attempt had been noted and that its failure was complete. The wreath, without its sash and without its letter, would be placed among the other tributes by the ceremonial attendants, photographed dutifully by the press as part of the general floral display, and forgotten within a week. The territorial claim would drift back into dormancy, where it would remain for another decade before the larger events of European history rendered it irrelevant entirely. None of this would be reported. None of it would appear in the newspapers that spent the next 3 days covering the funeral in exhaustive, reverent detail, the Kaiser's evident grief, the solemn faces of the assembled kings, the heartbreaking simplicity of the white coffin on the gun carriage. None of the correspondents who filed their dispatches that evening knew that anything had happened at the rear flank entry point. There was nothing to know. There had been no incident. The procession had moved exactly as planned. Captain Alderton returned to the formation 40 minutes after his departure, which was long enough that Thomas had begun to wonder whether he was going to return at all. He appeared at Thomas's left shoulder without announcement and stood beside him in silence for a moment, both of them watching the tail end of the procession move steadily away down the street. "The document," Alderton said quietly without looking at him, "has been passed to the Foreign Office. The item you flagged in Appendix 7 has been secured." He paused. "Count Voss will be returning to Vienna on the evening departure." Thomas said nothing. It did not seem like a moment that required a response. Alderton turned and looked at him for the first time since his return. "You read the appendices?" "Yes, sir." "All of them?" "Yes, sir." Alderton absorbed this. The expression on his face was not quite approval and not quite bewilderment. It occupied the specific territory between those two things that experienced officers sometimes reach when a junior soldier has done something that defies the available categories. He appeared to be trying to locate a frame for it and not quite finding one. He said, "Good work, Corporal." Then he walked back to his own position in the formation. That was all. No commendation, no formal acknowledgement, no entry in the regimental record that would have any meaning beyond the most bureaucratic interpretation of events. The official log for that day would show processional formation maintained without incident. One diplomatic tribute received outside registry, reclassified and repositioned by Lord Chamberlain attendants. All waypoint timings met. Thomas returned to his post and stood there for the remaining 4 hours of his assignment. At 3 in the afternoon, when the last element of the procession had passed, and the crowds had begun their slow dispersal back into the life of a city that was already, quietly, beginning to recalibrate itself to the idea of a world without Victoria in it, Thomas was dismissed with the rest of his section. He handed in his equipment, signed the logbook, and walked back to the barracks. In the washroom, he removed the territorial sash from his breast pocket and looked at it once more in the better light. The embroidery was extraordinary work, the kind of craftsmanship that had been built over centuries, stitched with the patient skill of people who understood that the things they made might outlast the causes they represented. The gold thread caught the light of the gas lamp and threw small, bright shapes against the washroom wall. He thought about Count Voss's face in that final moment, the long, measuring look that had contained neither anger nor concession, but something more honest than either. The look of a man who had lost a carefully constructed move and was deciding how to file it in memory, not as defeat, exactly, as information. He thought about the gun carriage moving past the crowds, the silence of 4 million people, the weight of what the morning had contained. He folded the sash carefully and took it to the duty officer's desk, where he placed it in the evidence envelope that had been prepared for it, and signed his name in the log with the date and time. Then he went to the mess, ate his supper, and went to bed. He had been awake for 19 hours. He slept without difficulty. 40 years later, a historian researching the diplomatic correspondence surrounding Victoria's funeral would find a single notation in a Foreign Office file dated February 2, 1901. It read, "Attempted insertion of territorial designation marker into state processional, intercepted at secondary entry point. Item secured. Matter resolved without public incident. Source: Regimental Duty Report, 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards." There was no name attached to it. There never was. The empires that had sent their representatives to stand in the cold that morning, the empire being buried, and the one whose representative had tried to use the burial for its own purposes, would both be gone within 20 years, swept away by the larger catastrophe that was already, in the winter of 1901, gathering itself quietly on the horizon. But the procession had moved as it was meant to move. The coffin had passed through streets of genuine mourning without being made into something it was not. The image that had been planned, the careful photograph with its political sash and its dynastic document, had never been taken. The dead queen had been carried to Windsor exactly as she had prescribed, undisturbed, uncommented upon, belonging only to the moment and the history that had made her. That had been enough. It had been, as it turned out, everything. Because duty is not about power. It is not about rank or recognition or the weight of authority behind your name. It is about knowing what you are protecting well enough to protect it alone, in the cold, at a rear flank entry point that no one else considered worth watching. It is about reading the appendices when everyone else has gone to sleep. And it is about standing exactly where you are supposed to stand, for exactly as long as it takes, even when the procession has moved so far ahead that you can no longer see it. Even then, especially then, was Thomas Hale right to hold his ground against a senior diplomat with nothing but a memorized protocol manual and a corporal's stripes? Was Captain Alderton justified in assigning a problem upward, then downward, until it landed on the least experienced man in the section? And if you had been standing at that entry point, 19 years old, no authority, no backup, the empire's farewell moving past you in real time, would you have stepped aside? Some things are worth protecting even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching.